In this lecture, we'll talk about how emotions are adaptive and the role that they serve across time and cultures. As a reminder, emotions are immediate, specific, negative, or positive responses to environmental events or internal thoughts. They also help guide humans to make successful choices or behave in successful ways, whether that's in social contexts or environments where you need to achieve other goals or protect yourself. So take a moment to think about how emotions are useful or adaptive for you. What did you think of? Emotions help you learn norms. If you say things to someone that makes them sad, you might learn that this isn't something that you want to repeat. If you want to ask your parent for some extra spending money or your boss for a raise, but you notice that they look very angry, you might consider approaching them at another time when they appear more at ease or approachable. So, these are just a few examples of maybe how understanding emotions have been useful or adaptive for you. So, emotions can be adaptive by how they are expressed, whether that's by facial expressions or clear verbal expressions of emotion, and they can also strengthen bonds and bring people together. We know facial expressions through the positioning of the eyes and mouth can communicate emotions. Just take a look at this chart here on the right that describes common patterns of facial expressions associated with certain emotions. Like with sadness, you can see drooping upper eyelids, you can see that there's less focus in the eyes and a slight pulling down of lip corners. Each emotion here, specifically these primary or basic emotions that we talked about earlier, seems to be associated with certain patterns of facial expressions. So, one of the crucial questions in emotion research is the cross-cultural universality of emotion expression. So, basically, are facial expressions universal? Paul Ekman was one of the early researchers looking into this topic. He initially proposed that the meaning of facial expressions are socially learned, so that the meaning of expressions should vary across cultures, is what he initially thought. In this study that he conducted, participants in New Guinea were photographed displaying certain facial expressions. For example, they were asked to look like they would if they'd come across a rotting pig, or how they would look if their children had passed away. And then participants from other countries were asked to identify the emotions being expressed by the New Guineans. So these are some of the pictures over here that were taken, and the results suggested that people across cultures largely agreed on the meaning of different facial expressions, such as happiness, sadness, anger, and disgust. So, based on these results and this work that Paul Ekman did, he failed to support his original hypothesis and found that some basic facial expressions may be biologically based or universal, particularly happiness, and less so for disgust and fear. But these are those primary emotions and those basic emotions that we talked about in the last lecture when we were looking at how to classify emotions. There is room for debate, however, on whether facial expressions are universal and if this conclusion was a bit too, if this conclusion was a bit elementary, or just whether it excludes nuances and more details. So this linked reading is included for this week as well, so I want you all to take a look at that and think a little bit about criticisms about this idea of facial expressions being universal. Alright, so display rules are relevant to the expression of emotions as well. Basically, even if certain emotions are expressed similarly across cultures, they may still be demonstrated to different degrees and in different settings across cultures, and that's what display rules are referring to. These norms are learned through socialization and surrounding customs, and essentially, there are expectations for displaying certain emotions, and this might vary across sex, it might vary across age. Some examples of of these expectations might be that boys don't cry or women are emotional. So these sort of rules and standards can really impact who and how emotions are expressed. And furthermore, some people may just feel more free to express emotions than others do. So there's just some variability amongst people as well, or across people. As we mentioned earlier, emotions strengthen interpersonal relationships. If you see a friend crying, this might be a flag for you to check in with them and be supportive, or vice versa. If you are crying or looking really upset, then that might be an indication for a friend of yours or even a stranger to kind of step up and check in on you. And that's a way that social relationships and interpersonal relationships are formed and can strengthen. So, these emotional expressions and nonverbal interactions enable communication. This can happen across languages and development. So, this idea that basic emotions can be interpreted and seen across other cultures, people of different backgrounds and languages, is an example there. And also, infants aren't able to speak for a long time, or not a long time, but there are developmental stages. So, before there's ability for verbal interactions, babies and infants are expressing themselves fairly effectively through nonverbal interactions. Right. Evolutionary perspectives suggest that humans have a need to belong and monitor for cues that might indicate whether they're going to be ostracized or kicked out of social groups. These cues might be social emotions and facial expressions or verbal interactions. So it's important for people to pay attention to these in order to maintain bonds with people or strengthen their bonds with people and avoid breaking off these social bonds if that's not something they want to do. Some emotions only seem relevant to social contexts and might be influenced by social context, and that further supports this idea that emotions strengthen interpersonal bonds. So think about guilt and embarrassment, for example. If we weren't concerned about what others thought or what they think of us, these emotions probably wouldn't be quite as relevant or prominent at all. So guilt can promote and impact interpersonal relationships. This feeling of guilt might discourage behaviors that jeopardize relationships, whether that's referring to cheating or lying in a relationship or friendship. Feelings of guilt can indicate that you care about someone. If you're feeling guilty about something you did to someone, that could be a sign for you that you do care or that you feel badly about your actions. Additionally, guilt can manipulate others' behaviors, and guilt has been found to be present in healthy and happy relationships, including children who experience parental warmth. So there are a lot of ways in which this emotion in particular is influencing relationships or influenced by relationships and attachment. So embarrassment may happen as a result of violating a social norm, which really clearly indicates that that interpersonal relationships or values and ideas of other people might be impacting your emotions. Embarrassment also can help overcome interpersonal awkwardness and strengthen bonds. So these are just some additional examples of how emotions strengthen interpersonal relationships. And lastly, just referring back to the role of facial expressions for communication, it's also interesting to think about how communicating non-verbally or with our facial expressions and creating connections with other people has been impacted as a result of wearing masks during the pandemic. This is not a required reading for the course, but just might be something that's interesting to you all. And they basically find that there have been some hindrances to communicating and creating interpersonal bonds with people, possibly because of face masks, which might not come as a surprise. But yeah, just thought this might be interesting to look into. And that summarizes, or that sums up the module on emotions.